I do want to mention a couple of upcoming programs, we have tomorrow night Jim Levitt, who is a longtime friend of mine, who works at the Kennedy Library in Boston, Cambridge, he'll be talking about large landscape preservation, and environmental preservation in America, and with a specific look at Kansas City. On Tuesday, October 22nd, we have Timothy Egan, I think a very fine writer, New York Times columnist, who's written a book called A Pilgrimage to Eternity, From Canterbury to Rome in Search of Faith. He'll be talking essentially about the collapse of religion in the world and the meaning for that for all of us. And then we have on Wednesday, October 23rd, here at the Plaza, in the Timothy Egan, and I'll be having a conversation with Timothy Egan, by the way. We have on October 23rd, in partnership with the Lyric Opera of Kansas City, we have Bohemian Rhapsodies with David Charles Abell, who's been on this stage before as a conductor. Will be conducting the Lyric Opera's production of La Bohème, which will happen in early November. He'll be on stage talking about the origins of the idea of the Bohemians, the life of in the Bohemia of Paris, and the origins of that in Henry Murger's novel, The Scène de la Vie Bohème. And I can be shot for my French accent, I recognize. That should be a lot of fun, and there will be some music too, so look forward to that. And then last but not least, I want to mention on October 29th, we have Chuck Marone, Joe Minicozzi, and David Warm talking about smart growth in Kansas City. This has been part of a series we call Small Towns, and under the umbrella idea of what makes a great city. Chuck and Joe are part of a national movement. They're coming in from out of town about small-scale development and how it's much better from the city's point of view for land use, for taxes, for long-term development, and for building capital in poorer areas of the city. They'll be joined by David Warm, who is the CEO of the Mid-America Regional Council. This is made possible by Gould Evans, our partner. At the same time, we'll be presenting the beginnings of a deep study that's being paid for by one of our foundations about Kansas City and the problems and opportunities in terms of land use. I think where we are in the city, it's a very important subject. So tonight. First, I'm going to bring up David Thomson to talk to you for a few minutes, and then he and I are going to have a conversation. David is the greatest living film critic of the cinema, and his latest book, Sleeping with Strangers, describes the not-so-hidden, intimate lives of Hollywood in front of the camera, behind the camera, and in every bed in the Hollywood Hills. David will now defend the proposition made in the book that the Hollywood Production Code was, and he does actually say this in the book, was an attempt to impose the morals of Kansas on the movies. After his remarks, I will engage with him as a representative of the Kansas City League of Decency. So ladies and gentlemen, our greatest film critic, David Thomson.
Thank you so much. Crosby and I agreed that I would say a few words before we talked. Can you turn you're working on it. If I shout, is it? No, it's working. Oh, it's on, okay. So, I thought, well, what am I going to say for a few minutes beforehand? And something happened today, sublime chance, that made me know what I was going to talk about for just a few minutes. I'm going to begin not with the incident that happened today, but I'm going to name a handful of films that I suspect you all know, and I suspect that most of you enjoy. I'm going to pick Pulp Fiction, Shakespeare in Love, My Week with Marilyn, and The English Patient. I'm sure one or two of you here, maybe three or four, know one of the things that links those four films. But it's something that not a lot of people have known in the years in which they saw those films. But they were all produced or distributed or enabled or bullied and harassed into being by a man named Harvey Weinstein. He's been around a long time. And here is the incident that happened today. I was talking to a friend of mine, a film critic in London, by email. And she said, "Did I ever tell you when I roomed with so-and-so? So-and-so was Harvey Weinstein's personal assistant. And in 1997, she signed a non-disclosure agreement, almost as important as contracts and scripts in Hollywood, a non-disclosure agreement saying that she would not talk about what she knew about, which was the way her boss handled himself in the office back in 97. It had been going on for a while before then. And she was paid for the non-disclosure agreement. But my friend, who was rooming with her, went back to their flat, and the phone was on, being recorded. And it was Harvey. Unmistakable, gruff, pig-like voice, but very smart man. And he was talking into the recording machine for her, and he was saying how grateful he was for what she had done, how he thought it was a big career move for her. And as the talk went on, it became more and more amorous, as if to say, a non-disclosure agreement certainly was the beginning of a lovely friendship. And my friend stood there for several minutes. She was alone in the apartment, listening to this, and she was staggered by the self-love and the self-characterization. And she said to me today that something I concluded on the couple of occasions I've met Harvey Weinstein. She said, he's an actor. Whatever he's doing, whether he's saving a film or trashing an actress, he's acting the part because he's crazy about the movies and acting. This is no small part of what we now have come used to calling the Me Too movement and everything it represents. Harvey Weinstein had been doing what he had been doing ever since he got into power, because power was what enabled him and prompted him to do it. And I think, really, he got into the film business because of the power that it offered and because of the power over women that it offered. He directed himself a couple of films at the beginning. Few people know that. They're no good. But the fact that he directed them tells you something about him, that he really is fascinated by how film works. When he was in charge of My Week with Marilyn, he looked at the director's cut And he said, it's good, it's pretty good, but you know you're losing something that will give you a lift and will give us all a lift at the box office. There needs to be an opening scene where she is Marilyn doing an act. And everyone said, oh, well, that's not necessary, is it? We want to get into the story. That scene would be separate from the story. And Weinstein said, no, trust me, do it. And they did it, and it was a huge part of the film's success. On The English Patient, from the Michael Ondaatje novel, the film had been set up at 20th Century Fox, ready to go, and on the last minute, 20th Century Fox said, well, we're not really happy with Kristen Scott Thomas as the female lead. We think you need Demi Moore. And the people on the film, its actual producers, Saul Zaentz, Anthony Minghella, said no. At which point 20th Century Fox said, well, good night, we're gone. And they withdrew everything. And that film, which would win Best Picture, pretty good film, hanging in the balance, and Weinstein heard and said, I'll rescue you. And he came in and he bought up the whole thing and made it and interfered all the time. And when the film was over and when it was made and it made a profit, he would not pay the residual money to Minghella's widow. As far as I know, he has still not paid that money to Minghella's widow, and he probably now will never pay it. He didn't just harass women, he harassed budgets. He literally beat up men. He was a gangster. He was one of the first modern American gangsters. And, you know, it's quite a breed. But what I want you to understand, two things. This is a very bad man, and I am not making any kind of apology for him or defense of him. He loves movies, and he understands how they work. What does that tell you? It tells me this, that in the history of Hollywood, there have been Weinstein-like figures since it began. The whole question of harassment of actresses, screwing actresses to get them apart, or not to get apart, because it didn't always work out. That went on from the very beginning. And it's not just a casual sideline to our movies. It's part of a culture in which women were persistently put down, not necessarily abused, but limited and imprisoned in American movies. I'll give you one quick example. One of the films you've all seen, one of the films you all love, one of the films you would all probably vote into the best 3 or 4 American films ever made, is Casablanca. Correct?
Correct.
Fantastic characters, situation, wonderful American insouciance about the war, American guts and nerve will get us through the war. And with this remarkable, romantic, triangular situation that animates the film as to what Ilsa, the Ingrid Bergman character, will do. Will she go with Rick Bogart or Victor Laszlo, Paul Henry? That's all true. But don't ever forget this. She, Ilsa, never has a mind of her own. The two guys decide what's going to happen to her she's going to go off with Victor. She doesn't say at any point, well, I really don't like Victor's politics that much. He's a little bit too Trotskyist for me. And she certainly doesn't say, well, you know, when it comes down to it, I'm going to have to say, Rick is a lot better in bed. She simply doesn't have the beginnings of the intellectual, emotional identity that a woman should have. And you barely notice it in the film because it's a male show. And it's being run for a certain kind of film. Women will go to it, but it will make guys feel good about themselves. And we are in a situation in this country at the moment where the culture of movies in which guys were taught uncritically to feel good about themselves and being great is coming home to roost in the most diabolical way. You get the illusion, I'm sure. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about Harvey Weinstein, a truly terrible man. But if you wanted to really understand movies, talking a couple of hours to Harvey Weinstein would be a treat. You'd learn a lot. I did. Thank you. I'm moving over here.
So on that upbeat note, I wasn't planning on asking you about this, but you didn't tell me you were going to talk about Harvey either, so I'm going to ask you a question about a character who is in the book, and you talk about in terms of Chinatown, which is a great movie, both by Hollywood and ultimately about Hollywood, about the culture of corruption in Southern California. Roman Polanski is who I want to talk about.
Right.
So I want to ask you this question about Polanski. Polanski did something that it seems to me is at least equal to any of the casting couch, whatever, from abuse, sexual abuse to rape, or however you want to define Harvey Weinstein. What he did with the 13-year-old girl.
What he had done with countless people.
And with countless people, and I have two questions.
Yes.
One is why? Why was there anybody defending him at the time? It's not that long ago we're talking about, because it's gone on in various versions in court until fairly recently, and yet he's had a lot of Hollywood defenders. That's question number one. How did that happen? Because that's, the facts were out there. Everybody knew what the facts were. And the second question is, clearly, he couldn't get away with that today. Clearly, things have changed in a relatively short period of time. And why is that? So, two questions.
Okay. He made money for the system. Rosemary's Baby and Chinatown, both big box office pictures. Harvey made big box office pictures. If you can do that, you can get away with quite a lot. Just as in the world of politics, if you can make your money count in funding projects, bringing people to office, you'll stay doing that. He was a very effective operator. He's very talented. He's a charmer. He had powerful friends. Never forget whose house the incident occurred in. Do you remember that?
No, remind me.
Jack Nicholson's house.
Right.
And I will just say that at that time, involvement with underage females was not uncommon in Hollywood. That doesn't excuse it. But you say how he got away with it? All of those factors came into play, and also because the judge who sent him for 90 days observation, I think it was 90, and clearly had made a deal that he would be free then, revoked on that deal because he heard that he would be in trouble if he did that. And a lot of people in Hollywood, in the business, in the industry, felt that was unfair, and they felt angry about it, and so they wanted to take Roman's side. Does that answer?
Yeah, I think that answers it. But ultimately, it's the same culture of corruption you talk about with Harvey and going back to many things you mentioned in the book. But clearly, that's changed. I don't think Roman Polanski can come back from Switzerland or wherever he lives now, regardless of any legal circumstance.
No, don't forget, however, that the Academy that just a couple of years ago banned him and threw him out of the Academy, not that long before had given him an Oscar for Best Director.
Right.
We're talking about a world where values shift very fast, and integrity is not thick on the ground. He's still making films, well into his 80s. I'm told his most recent film about the Dreyfus affair is actually very good. No, he can't come back.
Will the movie be able to be shown in the United States?
Oh, of course it will be shown in the United States. All his previous movies have been shown here.
So the Me Too movement won't extend to
Look,
protesting the movie
when
of a child rapist?
in the last couple of years, Kevin Spacey was blackballed out of the business, right? They ceased work with him on House of Cards, if you remember, which
right.
was a show that had been instrumental in setting Netflix up. Did Netflix withdraw the first 4 series in which Kevin Spacey was playing, or can you still stream them? You know the answer. You can
of course I know the answer.
You can still stream them.
Yeah.
In other words, the degree of compromise is staggering, and integrity is something you make up as you go around the corner.
And so one of the themes of the book is the lack of Hollywood integrity around issues of sex and lust and power. You quote Peter Guber. I won't quote it exactly. It is a family library saying it's all ultimately about sex and power, and that they're the same thing.
Yes.
And but at the same time, you give Hollywood some credit, some certain movies credit, and the direction of Hollywood for liberating us from some of these constraints.
Well, liberating, I'm not sure. Shaping us, educating us, yes. I mean, the movies have done far more than we can grasp still, because we go to the movies and we say we like them or not. We don't spend nearly enough time talking about what they've done to us. For instance, what the concept of courage and truthfulness is in these films, what the role of women is in these films, for instance. Those things just get shoved aside. They're supposed to be secondary, so we don't waste time on them. But we've been made by it. I mean, I was born and raised in another country, and for good and ill, and I mean it, for good and ill, I've done a lot of bad things in life, some of which I think come from being raised as a movie nut. They made me. It probably did you. Not to say other things haven't made us too, and this probably applies to most people here. And it's very complicated, and it really is for good and ill, but for God's sake, we have to really start sitting down and talking about it.
And this really is at the end of your book, not the beginning, but it occurs to me now, and I wasn't going to talk about it exactly this way, but the streaming video, the TV, the dominance of TV, and the coming of the Marvel movies and all that, you make a case that we're atomized in a way we weren't by the classic era of Hollywood movies. And in a way, I think it's true, and I think it's true of film criticism too. There isn't that much film criticism anymore.
No.
Just as there isn't, we don't have a film critic at the Kansas City Star. We don't, your regular gig at the New Republic disappeared with the New Republic. And I remember that when I became enamored of movies, I loved movies when I was a kid, but I really got into it in college. And we talked about movies all the time. We saw lots of movies, and we talked about the critics. Pauline Kael had a fan club. I don't know that Stanley had Kaufman had that big a fan club.
Absolutely.
And we talked about the various film critics. We talked about movies all the time. And of course, if you go to a movie today, if you go out to a movie in particular, you have a couple of good friends you might talk to, but none of the obsessive compulsive talk about movies and life.
There's one film at the moment, I think, that people are talking about in the way they talked about, let's say, Bonnie and Clyde, The Godfather, a whole lot of other films, Nashville. You know the film I'm thinking of? I suspect you haven't.
It's out right now?
It's out right now.
Okay, no, I don't. I'm not sure.
Joker.
Oh, Joker, yeah.
Now, I think Joker is boring, very badly made, pretentious, and horrible. If I had been a film distributor, I would seriously, even if you had told me it's going to make $500 million internationally in 2 weeks, which is what it's done, I would have been very serious about not taking it on, because I think there's a potential for damage in it. However, in the last 20 minutes of the film, and it's a long wait to get there, Joaquin Phoenix turns into a spirit, a fairy, a demon, and he sort of dances, and it's amazing. Now, that's not what is being talked about. I think what is being talked about
Violence.
is it's the violence, and it's the whole question as to whether this film could provoke more violence, but whether it really catches the persona of some of the young men who do these shootings at schools or malls or clubs or wherever.
Right.
And I had a talk with my son, who's 24, and he said, you know, there's a lot of talk out there among sick kids. There's a lot of sick kids, he says,
right,
about how this film understands them.
right. So I was planning on talking about sex mostly.
Well, good
but
for
here
you.
Here we are talking about violence.
Violence is sex.
Okay.
Sex and violence are twins in American cinema.
I think there's obviously an element of truth in that, but let's talk a little bit about the great movies that which do have that balletic quality of violence, that have that emotional quality that turns violence into sex. And you begin your book with Bonnie and Clyde.
Right.
And I did want to ask you, you saw it 5 times. When you were in your early 20s, I would guess, when you saw it. I want to ask you, wasn't there a good book that could, no.
I was publishing good books.
Right.
I was working for a publishing house.
Bonnie and Clyde's a slick and pretty movie that ends with and has moments during the course of it of the choreographed violence. I mean, it's the first time we really get that choreographed violence. And the Wild Bunch is about the same time.
2 years later.
Yeah, 2 years later. And you put the Wild Bunch and Bonnie and Clyde into sort of the same bucket of pretty violence. I have to say, Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway versus Ernest Borgnine and Warren Oates. I'm not sure I completely agree with you about that, but when I saw it, I thought this is a fairly extraordinary movie, which I don't feel about it any longer. I think it's really it's the beginning of Warren Beatty's narcissism. It's an incredibly narcissistic movie. When knowing what we know about Warren Beatty as an actor, as a film character, also of course what we know about his life, but the balletic quality of the violence what attracts you so much to that? I mean, you talk about the style of the movie. What is so what got you when you were 20, whatever it was you were?
It was exactly the thing we were talking about before. It was the fusion of the sex and the violence. Because remember,
But there's no sex.
which is what makes the violence so tumescent and so exciting. The violence is a foreplay to the sex that will come to them eventually. And it is part of the life and the togetherness they get into. And I know that's what excited me in that film. Plus the whole question of the way in which Bonnie, who is actually the more intelligent of the two, the more constructive, the way she works it out that Clyde needs identity. And she writes that poem and sends it to the newspapers. And he says, you know what you've done? You told my story. That's where they have sex for the first time. It's the way in which she, the woman, gives birth to his identity. Very important to me at that time, very important to Hollywood at that time. Not proud of it necessarily, but if you ask why and how it worked for me, that's how it worked for me. It was also a film that told me, you've got to get to America fast.
Well,
and that was an extremely pressing thing in my life.
So you're making a case that it's a sort of feminist movie. In the book, you also make the case that it's that's a major theme of the book, about the sort of gay hideaway, the gay undercurrent of filmmaking. But it's really, it's a very superficial, it's a very shallow movie, I think. And it
Pauline Kael said, movies are shallow.
Okay. Well.
Face it. You know, they last 2 hours. Can you believe they used to last 2 hours?
Or less, an hour and a half.
Even less.
Yes.
And they're for millions of people. Of course they're shallow. I mean, they're like popular songs. They're like rock and roll. They're for now. Now, universities such as we know study them. People get tenure writing about them. I have a career writing about them, more or less a career. And it's become part of the academy. But I truly think that that was not what film was made to be. Film became part of the academy because a lot of people wanted jobs. So they started thinking, you know, we can talk about these films seriously. We can refer them to French philosophers, etc., which is all fine. A lot of good work comes out of it. But really what they're about is two kids in any town in America coming out of that film and saying, wow, that is shallow. This is a very shallow country. And it's about time America faced up to that.
Oh my God. Okay. So representing the Kansas City League of Decency.
I didn't mention Kansas City.
You didn't mention Kansas City?
As being shallow.
Oh, Kansas. You talked about the morals of Kansas.
That was another context.
And you talked about Jean Harlow, our idol from Kansas City, as being shallow. But
good job she didn't stay in Kansas City.
Well, she got out. It's true. You say in the book, and I'm quoting you, if it was gay to furnish movies with supreme clothes, getting back to the style question here, clothes play a major role in the book, then it was a gay insight that admitted how fraudulent American romance was in the Depression. So what I want to say is, I forget exactly where this quote is, but you talk about Dietrich and Garbo. And are you saying there was no romance in those movies?
No. I think that it was fraudulent. I think it was posited upon the idea that romance could make you happy, and life was over.
But the Garbo movies and the Dietrich movies, I mean, sometimes they're happy endings and whatnot, but they're really, Garbo and Camille. I mean, Dietrich Dietrich's practically got a whip in her hand, and you point out that there's a song that she doesn't get to sing. The studio cut it out. If it's not pain, it isn't love.
Right.
But even though they cut
they were European. It's a little different with American actresses. Now there are some
American
that
movies.
were very inventive, and like Hepburn and Davis. But what I'm talking about is the mainstream of romance in American movies of the 20s, 30s, 40s, which is still there today in maybe the most virulent form that movies have, commercials. The notion of happiness and a pretty girl and a handsome guy who are going to get happiness, and that car or that beer or that shampoo will get it for them. As craven and threadbare a philosophy as anything that passed in movies of the Golden Age. It's still with us.
You're shattering my illusions.
That's what I come to Kansas for.
Yeah. Oh God. Oh God. Okay. Well, so let's talk about some other movies that might be a challenge to your theory. So another movie made in 1967, Bonnie and Clyde, the year of Bonnie and Clyde, that also has a tremendous sense of style. It's a movie I remember as representing romance the way I think of it, and I think has an element of reality to it at least, is Two for the Road. You remember Two for the Road?
Sure.
Audrey Hepburn.
No, I know Two for the Road.
Albert Finney.
It's an English film.
Well, it was distributed in the United States by Hollywood.
Yeah, of course. But I mean, it is an English film. And I like it, you know. It is certainly truer to a more grown-up kind of life, which I think is what you would say for it.
Yeah.
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 I agree. I agree.
And it's about, and this is a subject you deal with, and I think brilliantly in the book, and it's to me kind of counter to the Bonnie and Clyde American Gigolo part of the book. It is about conversation in the movies, about talk in the movies, and Two for the Road to me was one of those kinds of movies. It's not exactly a seduction movie, but it's a movie about love based on essentially on conversation and shared experience.
I agree with you entirely, and conversation is vital to it. It's written by a very good writer, Frederick Raphael, and you know, by that era, there were films like that. I mean, you know, even there are conversations in Chinatown that are actually very good conversations.
Oh, it's a great dialogue in the movies.
Yes,
yeah,
yeah.
Absolutely.
But I love conversation in films, and I lament that there is so little in our films nowadays. That the whole idea that we might aspire to it has gone away, and people talk in slogans in films now.
Right, and I think I would agree with you to some extent about that. So you have this view. You say, I'm going to quote you again. Again, it comes down to style and the prettiness of movies and the fraudulence of that. You say citizenship in Hollywood depended on being good looking. But let me challenge that for a second. Here's my central case for you. Eddie Bracken.
A nothing.
A nothing?
Well, not a nothing.
No,
not significant.
So Preston Sturges made some of the great movies. You and I would agree about that.
Totally.
Right.
And Bracken is very good in a couple of those films. But he's not a Central American actor in the way Cary Grant is, in the way James Stewart is, Henry Fonda, Cagney, Bogart.
Tracy.
The notion of good looking. Now, Tracy's a bit more interesting. Tracy never bothered to be good looking.
Yeah, he's not classically good looking, but he was one of the biggest stars.
But you know, I mean, where does the phrase good looking come from? What does it mean? Do you believe you can tell whether someone's good by looking at them?
Oh, well, it's about the look, that the good is a qualifier. It's not the thing itself. And I would agree with you about that. I have absolutely a Platonic view of this.
Yeah.
But Tracy, so you don't think Bracken is a big star, but Tracy is
Tracy was a big star, and Tracy was an exceptional figure. I talk in the book about how, in my opinion, Tracy and Hepburn were very lucky to find each other, because those were two careers that were trailing away a little bit because they didn't do romance very well. Tracy was never good at love scenes, neither was she for that matter. When they found each other and writers heard them in reality talking, conversation again, and sort of squabbling, needling each other, they found that that was a way they could do their kind of film.
You have a great line in the book that I think explicates just what you've said. They had distinctive voices, force of character, and a faith in speaking. I can't read my word I've got down here. Without becoming humorless, speaking truth, I think, without becoming humorless. And I think that's exactly right. But they're both icons, and I think Hepburn is beautiful in her way, but it's in her way. She's not a classic beauty. She's not a Hollywood prettified beauty.
Absolutely. I mean, she was one of the boldest, most idiosyncratic, rebellious actresses in Hollywood.
Yeah, and as you say, she had a fascinating career, particularly before the Hepburn Tracy movies. They're weird and wonderful movies like Christopher Strong, which is one of the strangest movies ever. You talk a little bit about Dorothy Arzner, but you in passing mention Christopher Strong. Talk about style and phantom threads.
Yeah.
The costumes in Christopher Strong are among the
I'll tell you the thing about Hepburn. I spent a day with her, and I spent days with a lot of actors and actresses, and usually they're intensely boring because they're being the image that they think you expect from them. Hepburn was wild the whole time, didn't do anything I would have predicted, and she was totally natural in that every now and then she'd ask me about me. Believe me, actors don't do that very much.
Right. Yeah. You quote her. You put two quotes from interviews with her together. Wild and logical. That she was both those things and could be both those things at the same time. Yeah. And which comes through in in Adam's Rib, in Pat and Mike, and a good number of their movies. Most of those movies, the Hepburn Tracy movies, are not very good movies.
I agree.
But they're almost always
not as
riveting.
good, I think. See if you agree. They're not as good as the Cary Grant movies of about the same era.
Right. I think that's true.
How that happened is fascinating.
With the exception of Adam's Rib.
Yeah, that's the best of their films, I think.
And you say something that I want to disagree with. Though initially when I read it, I completely agreed, and light bulbs went on, and then I thought, no, not really true. And that is, you say you can't imagine Tracy and Hepburn having sex, and I want to say, but you can imagine them being in love, which in fact there's a cottage industry investigating the question of whether or not they were really in love and whether they ever had sex. The many versions of who they had sex with,
but it's
which you go into in some detail in the book.
But it's a very important thing for all of us to remember that you don't have to have sex to be in love.
Okay, I agree with that, absolutely. But I think it's also true that just because they had a clearly companionate relationship in the movies and possibly in at least part of their lives.
But part of the time, anyway.
Right, part of the time. Yeah. That excludes sex. I think you make it feel for us that it excludes sex, both when we're watching the movie. In Adam's Rib, you basically call it sexless, which I don't think is true. And I think they're the pat on the fanny, the farewell Amanda, and then there's
Under the Table.
End of the table.
Yeah.
Right. And then there's the moment which to me is the key to the movie is the home movie scene in the movie.
Oh yeah.
Where they're
Good point.
they're
Lovely.
investigating, they're seeing again
Yes.
that moment when
And
they
how
were
they
in love,
looked. How
and
they
they're
looked.
they're
Yeah.
they're humorous, it's funny,
Yeah.
it's light, and you feel they were in love then, and they feel that.
Excellent point. Good. I love that.
Finally made one. Okay, so let's go back to Cary Grant then, too,
Yeah.
because I think I love the chapter on Cary Grant because we've spent most of the last couple of decades trying to decide whether Cary Grant was gay or not.
Right.
And you basically say in the book, it doesn't matter.
Right.
We don't really know. He probably was in love with some, or had great relationships with some women, maybe even his wives. And talk about Cary Grant a little bit, because I think you're very wise on the subject of Cary Grant and what his appeal was and how he felt about it.
Well, I don't know how many people here know, but Cary Grant was born in Bristol, in England, quite lowly circumstances. And he comes home from school one day when he's 9, let's say, and his mother's not there, and his father doesn't know where the mother is. And he doesn't see the mother again for about 20 years. And the father says, well, she must have just gone away. And in fact, the father had put her in a mental hospital in Bristol that Archie, which is his name then, used to go past every day. And he only finds out about that in the 1930s when his father dies, and the solicitor handling his father's estate says, there is one problem, what are we going to do with your mother? And I think it's reasonable to take that as a source of enormous emotional confusion and grief and instability. And I think that Grant was always an agonized, anxious man who had found that he could be the most sophisticated person on earth on camera. And that duality I find fascinating, and it's there all through the films. And it's why he thinks so much about what's happening to his characters in films in a way that at the time he did it, nobody knew was great film acting.
Right.
It now looks like.
It looks like it to me, for sure, that I'm sure you've read the essay that Pauline Kael wrote about film acting, in which she says, Olivier's really an actor and Cary Grant's a personality.
Absolutely.
And she's wrong.
Yeah.
I think she's absolutely wrong. Part of it to me is the emotional turmoil that he must have had from his youth on. Is there's always a distance in the way he looks at the rest of us without losing warmth. It's still warm. He's just considering.
Yeah.
It's intelligence.
I totally agree. I mean, there's a film he made for Hitchcock called Suspicion, which is not as well known as some of the others like Notorious, North by Northwest.
Mm-hmm.
Suspicion is an amazing film. If you love Cary Grant, go look at that film. It's staggering. And so many of his smaller films repay more viewing than people.
Of course, Suspicion, he's playing probably the bad guy. And tell me, I don't remember the exact story. There may have been a different ending.
He was supposed to be
the murderer,
a man who was going to murder his wife.
Right.
And in the end, Hitchcock bowed to studio pressures and said, no, that's just a silliness. And it's all made up at the end. And the ending of the film is appalling. That's a film that cries out to be remade.
Well, okay, maybe you're right, except I've got to say the moment where, it's Hitchcock opens the door, literally he opens the door of the car and, while they're on the cliff.
You know what Hitchcock feels about it.
He wants to push her out, obviously, but doesn't, but it's a moment of unbelievably great tension.
Yeah. It's a very, very good film until the last few minutes.
So we're in agreement about that. And here's another movie that we're in complete agreement about. You and I have talked about this before, and I want to challenge your general view of Hollywood with this film. And it's His Girl Friday. His Girl Friday is the great talking film I mean, there's more dialogue per second in that movie than
One
in
of
any
the best.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the man and the woman, Cary Grant and Rosalind Russell, are equally matched. I mean, you say yourself in the book, you talk about their complicated battle that, you know, that's what the movie is about, and is wonderful because they're equally matched.
And you know, the thing about it is, there's this couple, they've been married. He behaved badly, because he's always going to behave badly. They get divorced. She's about to marry another man, and the moment he hears that, he has to get her back.
His competitive instincts are
So
up.
he gets her back. The logic of it is that once he's got her back, they'll break up again, so that he can get her back again. It's a cyclical thing.
Yeah, except the ending of the movie, of course, is they're gonna go off to the next story, and they're gonna, you know, their life
Certainly
is
not going to go off and have children.
well, they're not gonna have children. That's probably true. The paper is their
Stories
children.
they'll have. Yeah.
But they'll have stories.
Yeah.
And it's about the story. It's you know, that's the way the Odyssey ends is with Odysseus
Yeah.
and Penelope telling each other the stories of the last 20 years.
But you know, the fascinating thing is that that comes from a stage play, the front page, in
Right.
which the characters were two men.
Men, yes.
And Hawks, the director of His Girl Friday, had a read-through of it where I think he got his wife to play one of the parts to show that it could be a man and a woman. A brilliant touch.
A brilliant idea.
Yeah, yeah.
And the movie is all about the dialogue. And, I mean, it's such great dialogue. But it also has a sense of style. It's sort of a creeps in on you sense of style. You know, I read what you wrote about Phantom Thread, which I was, you know, I had to pinch myself to stay awake during parts of it. And I can't remember one of the dresses, but I'll tell you from the first moment I saw His Girl Friday, Hildy's hat.
Oh, yeah.
You just can't forget Hildy's hat, and it, you know, it announces her in a way.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's a phenomenal sense of style.
I agree. Yeah.
Okay, well, good. Well,
Yeah.
you know, here we are.
You've got to
agreeing.
go to the movies with someone who will pinch you.
Yeah, well, I do. I
Good,
do.
good.
Yeah, she pinches me on principle, actually.
Good.
But, sorry, Eddie. Yeah. Okay. Well, we're starting to wind up, and I want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions. But I do want to quote you, and I think this is in the chapter about Hepburn and Tracy that I really like. The motif of their films was the argument between men and women who were fond and loyal, but too understood that to be swept off their, but to understand too that to be swept off their feet by love or sex was not necessary. Though I would have a slight amendment of that and say, but it can be, so they can be swept off their feet by love. Maybe less so by sex, at least in Adam's Rib and some of the other Hepburn Tracy.
Yeah.
But I do like the idea that it's the ongoing, and the argument has to be, it has to have quality to it. It has to have a sense of style in the argument.
But now, do you feel as I do that in our films now, to generalize, but I will generalize, there is a good deal less love and sex than there used to be? Why is that happening?
I think you're right, number one. I think you're right. I think there's it goes back to what you said about violence. That violence has become our sex, and some of it's cartoon violence in the superhero movies. I mean, I really don't understand why everybody's going to the superhero movies. Can anybody here, we'll do this later at the bar, but tell me the plot of any one of the superhero movies off the top of their head, you know,
but I think
any dialogue.
There's something else that I want to just throw in. I think the influence of pornography is profound. This is a really pornographic culture.
Oh, well, I mean, I think the violence is pornographic. I would agree with you about
Absolutely.
that. And I think we've
And
done.
pornography is violence a lot of the time.
Yeah. You like Boogie Nights, and I hated it, but
That's not pornography.
yeah, well, it's about pornography. So, I think at some level we agree about this, and I think there's a we need some of it has to do with the nature of movies, the cutting of movies. I think it's largely significantly about editing. No scene lasts longer than 10 or 12 seconds anymore. I mean, there is no such thing as the long continuous shot. In Pat and Mike, my wife and I watched Pat and Mike 2 nights ago, and there is this incredible scene where she's training. He's riding a bicycle, and Tracy riding a bicycle by itself is worth watching.
Yes.
And she and Aldo Ray are training, and they're running.
Yeah.
And they're running down a path, and the shot goes on. The scene goes on for about 5 minutes.
It's so funny that we're all preoccupied with streaming, which is an interesting word. When streaming action, in other words, continuous action, doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah.
You know.
And it's all immediate. I think it's about stimulus. I think we are gluttons for stimulus, and I think it has less to do with pornography. It has something to do with violence, but it really has to do with the way our brains are now wired.
I think it has a lot to do with the fact that more and more people who get into movies have had some training in making commercials too.
That, and I'd agree with you about that. So the last phrase I want to quote from the book, because I like it so much, and maybe this relates to what we're just talking about, is you talk about moments of intimacy in the movies, and how the movies were once upon a time great at giving that to us, but the intimacy we're getting from the movies now is this kind of physical reaction to immediate stimulus. So the violence, the superhero movies, bang, 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 and we've lost something. And I think I'm agreeing with your basic theme that movies have abandoned that. They did once have it. The movies of Capra, Sturgis, Ford. Though the dialogue could be fast and furious, and Hawks, the greatest moments in the movies are intimate moments.
But so much of our lives are terrified of intimacy. I mean, I think it's staggering as a political move, a lack of a political move, that the president is never seen with his son. I mean, a moment or two of him kidding around with his son. Can you imagine the gold there is in that kind of casual intimacy? He doesn't do that kind of thing. He simply doesn't have an interest in intimate moments with anyone, just with the camera. And I pick him because it's hard to avoid him. But I think it's true of a lot of us that we're being told that casual intimacy is not as valuable as once we thought it was.
Yeah, I think that's true. And the fact that his greatest success in life before he became president was as a reality TV star. His real estate career really wasn't
Totally, yeah.
successful. His greatest success was as a reality TV star. And what is the one thing we know about reality TV?
You don't trust it.
There's no reality.
Yeah.
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 Okay, well, with that, I want to turn it over to the audience. Questions for David? Yes.
I haven't heard, but as a child growing up in the 60s, James Bond, with all those movies, with this hero image, male, the suave with the ladies, fist fights, what is your take on the action figures like The Saint, James Bond, and others, that Shaft, for me, that the sex and the violence, I really get. what you're saying and appreciate it.
Well, I never fell for James Bond. I've never liked him. I'll take Sean Connery because I think Connery found a very, very interesting, cruel persona. And I thought that was genuinely new and interesting. But, you know, once he got on to other people, that franchise just lost me completely. And I have no patience with superheroes at all. And there are several of the Bond films I've never even seen.
Shocking revelation.
I
here
used to
tonight.
see them through the 60s, but then I sort of really thought, why bother, you know?
What present-day director or directors and also actors do you find most interesting?
That's so difficult because I asked off the top of my head. I mean, there are Michael Haneke, I think, is a very good director, interesting director. I like Paul Thomas Anderson. The actor I have learned to be wild about in the last 2 or 3 years, Brad Pitt. I think Brad Pitt is becoming a huge iconic figure. And Pitt in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which I didn't like as a whole, but the scene where he goes up to the ranch, if you remember that scene, that's an incredible scene for an actor, and he carries it off beautifully. So, you know, I would say Brad Pitt.
I have so many questions, but I'll narrow it down to one. What exactly about the classic Hollywood studio system and the production code and like the 30s through the 50s influenced, or would you say influenced or reflected American sex views?
Well, it was a code of flirtation and seduction, which I think most people found beguiling, because it was at a time socially and culturally where people who've gone back 2 generations in their family, they would not have thought they were going to have sex for sex's sake. I mean, you know, you have to realize, you're too young, but trust me, there was a moment in our time when women particularly said, this could be fun. Sex could be pleasant. And you might indulge it rather like taking a walk, when you didn't have to take a walk, but let's go for a walk. And sex could be like that. That was a stunning moment. Now, it depended upon the technology of the birth control pill, which of course was a male imposition on women. Men didn't take the pill, women took it. But still, I happen to have lived through the moment, and perhaps you did too, when you could go from being extremely scared about having sex because of what might result from it, to thinking, I think it's going to be okay. That relaxes the human spirit in a wonderful way. So I think that was a big, big part of it. The other thing was, and again, you wouldn't know this, and I'm not disparaging that, but as a kid in South London, I went to theaters of 2,000 seats that were always packed. And you saw the film with your community. And people laughed and sighed and shuddered in unison. It was a communal, collective response. And that was a very big part of what made the movies. And if you think that the movies were great in the years of the Depression and the war, when everyone had a lot to be afraid of, a lot of anxiety, and going to the movies was an extraordinary way for a couple of hours of easing that anxiety. And you know, my mother was a member of that generation, and when I got interested in films and I would talk to her about them, she would say, "Oh, I don't want to talk about films in that way. I just want to have a nice time." Well, millions of people all over the world, many of them in much worse circumstances than Britain or America had a nice time. That was vital to the whole thing. There was an era of television that was like that too, where everyone was watching television and the same programs, not the immense variety that you can watch now. And a collective medium like that is a profound thing.
In this era of increased transparency, I know we who are part of the audience have to think about whether do we really want to go see a production with an actor who we know is a bad person or a director who's a bad person. I mean, for instance, I won't go to Woody Allen movies anymore. But I'm just wondering how you as a critic, it's such a, when someone a bad person makes a great movie or a bad person is a great actor, or, I mean, how does that factor into anything that you write or think about when you're reviewing something?
For me, no. I mean, I haven't gone to a few Woody Allen films lately because they're not very good. I used to think he was a terrific director, and I loved the way he made a film every year. I would go and see a Polanski film. I mean, things Crosby was saying about Polanski are true and shocking, and it's my weakness, but I'm not shocked. I know that so many of the people who make movies have things to be ashamed of. Doesn't mean they are ashamed of them, but it could be, you know. But you know, I don't think artists as a whole are or have to be nice people. I think a lot of them are very difficult. And I think living with them is not easy or nice or pleasant. So, no, that doesn't upset me at all. I mean, for instance, and for some people this is the worst of all, I like watching Leni Riefenstahl films. You know who she was? Leni Riefenstahl made propaganda films, Triumph of the Will, and Olympia of the 1936 Olympic Games. She was then blackballed completely because it was regarded as Nazi propaganda, which it was, but she was an incredible filmmaker. And I sometimes watch them for pleasure.
Speaking of talking films, My Dinner with Andre, how did you feel about it?
I haven't seen it since it came out. I loved it, though, when it came out, and I hope I would still love it. I mean, we were talking earlier about the problem of you don't see a film for 30 years, and in your head it's a great film, and you go to see it, and after 20 minutes you say, oh, this is not the film I saw before. And it can work the other way, that a film you didn't like suddenly comes alive. But I suspect My Dinner with Andre is pretty good, yeah.
I've always been curious about the scene in Bringing Up Baby where Cary Grant jumps up in the air and says, I must be gay or something.
Yes.
And, I mean, it was, I guess, a popular, or it was a term in Hollywood, but not in the country, I assume. So what was, they put that in there for an inside joke, or do you have any insight at that?
The best research suggests he improvised it.
Is that right?
And
But he was
he knew,
using the term
he knew
in the
what
film
it meant
as
for a
we
few.
understand it today, correct?
Well, my guess is, and I'm not certain about this, but I don't think many people would have understood what it meant then in 1938. He knew that a few people would know.
Wait, a few people or everyone in Hollywood?
Oh,
Everybody on the set, probably. He was probably vamping on the set.
that's fair enough. That's a good point. Most people in Hollywood, yeah.
The other thing I want to talk about is Night of the Iguana.
Night of the Iguana?
Yeah, and how, I guess Houston's turning everything in the way, the parameters that you were using tonight, it's just kind of the opposite. The violence is humorous, and I guess so is the sex. You know,
I haven't seen that for so long. I'm sorry. I mean, it's a bad answer. I will go see it again. I don't remember it
that
very
one and the
well.
one he made right after that, based on Flannery O'Connor's story.
Wise Blood.
Wise Blood,
Blood,
yeah.
right.
That's a little bit after, yeah. I mean, Houston was a very variable director. He could do films he clearly didn't care about, and then suddenly a film he did care about.
Well, in those two films in particular, it seems like, yeah. In those two films in particular, to me.
He does care, you feel. Wise Blood, certainly. Yeah.
Night of the Iguana as a film is one of the things it's famous for is that, and Houston was pretty good at this, by the end of the movie, everyone on the set hated everyone else on the set.
Yeah. He was a needler. Yeah.
Well, the scene I really like in Night of the Iguana, which I watched the other night, was when he's tied up in the hammock and he goes from being really crazy until he calms down at the end and they untie him.
I'm sorry, I can't help on this.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
You were talking about not having as many movie critics today, and also there was reference to conversation about movies. I go to the movies a lot. I like movies, but mostly I come out of it just thinking it's a bunch of plots and people that instant gratification and impulse control, and it's kind of like, is that what the movies are about? And this even includes the superhero movies.
Yeah.
It's like, how many movies are there in the last 5 years
Right.
that would lead to deep conversations
Yes.
that
Too
you
few.
would get something from? I
Too
come out
few.
of a movie and I think,
But now,
okay, it was a movie, but
but I would say this, that the kind of conversation you're talking about in response to films, I've had that with my wife, with friends in recent years of Breaking Bad.
sure. Actually, some of the streaming things, there's more conversation
Well,
than in the movies.
That's right. And I think there's a lot of stuff which I watch on a television screen that are actually made like movies. They're made like movies from the old studio
Incredible,
system.
the budget. for
Very,
this
very
streaming.
good stuff. I think the best script writing is there these days.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm disappointed in most of the movies that I see.
Yeah.
And you have reviews and papers and stuff, even though you don't have critics that you recognize the names of, as Ebert and these things. But I go because I like to go to movies. But I come out of it and I just think, didn't get much out of that movie.
Have you
Just
seen-
Fast and Furious.
Yeah. Have you seen a German film that opened, I think it opened this year, might even have been last year, called Transit?
I'll tell you, I'm relying more and more on the foreign films.
Transit is a sublime film. Wonderful picture, I think.
Get that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's the same director who made the movie about East German
Yeah.
spies. And
Christian Petzold.
Christian
Yeah,
Petzold, yeah.
Very,
Yeah,
very
which is
interesting
brilliant,
director,
yeah.
I think, yeah.
Sure.
Hi, it seems to me I get the greatest pleasure today going to documentaries.
Yes,
That a film like that I just, wept through practically was Linda Ronstadt, The Sound of My Voice.
oh, yeah, yeah.
That's my generation and probably
Yes.
this generation. The David Crosby film. I mean, I think there's so much more to those.
I agree.
I mean, the one where Robert McNamara was interviewed and he admitted he screwed up on Vietnam.
Yeah,
Whereas our buddy
That's
Cheney has never admitted
the
that
Errol
he
Morris
screwed
film.
up on
Yeah,
Iraq.
Yeah.
So I
a
think
film I
films
would
like
throw
that
in-
are what give me pleasure.
A film I would throw into that list is a film that will open in November called 63 Up. You know the Up films, which began with 7 Up, and they followed these kids all the way through, and 63 Up will open in November. It's really so moving. I strongly recommend that. But I agree with you about
He's still doing it?
I know, yeah. And so are the people. One person dropped out, but all the others have abided by it. They've stuck with it, you know. Yeah.
Well, on that up note, we'll stop tonight and thank David Thomson, please, for being here.
I
again.
thank you. Thank you.